keep in mind in economics debates is that you can always run a political economy argument or just a general social argument in lieu of an economics argument. So if you really have no idea what an austerity budget is, although I'll try and explain what that is later, and you don't really understand what the effects of that will be, it's always worth talking about the social consequences. So don't forget that economic policies affect minority groups. Don't forget that they affect the poor. And don't forget arguments about rights in economics debates. You should always run those arguments regardless of whether you actually know any economics. Particularly if you don't, you have to run those social arguments, because otherwise you have literally nothing to run in the debate. And as I've said on the slide, it is always worth putting a human face on any abstract principle. So if you're just going to say in the argument, well, this is going to lead to more or less growth, make sure you say why that's good, because we have more money to spend on people and welfare and all of those other sundry things we like to spend money on, and people are better off. Whereas if you just kind of throw jargon around, particularly if you are an economics student, then economics debates tend to get quite tedious, particularly because the jargon you're using is probably wrong. And as I've noted, I've posted a much longer guide on the internet which explains a lot more than I possibly have time to. Okay, the first really basic idea of economics is that people respond to incentives, which is basically that if you increase the cost of something, people will do it less, and if you increase the benefit to something, people will do it more. This is often run in debates to do with restriction regulation stuff. So people will run in debates that by banning something that they will necessarily will happen less. So in the death penalty debates, for example, it's often run that people will definitely commit less crime because they're committing the death penalty. A few things to keep in mind. Firstly, rewards or punishments might be in the future. People are really biased towards rewards or punishments that are happening now. So one of the reasons, for example, why people get fat is that they decide to eat lots and lots of sugary things now, and even if they know what the long-term consequence is, because they care more about now than they do about the future. Also, as it says on the slide, people don't act rationally. They use all kinds of stereotypes to make decisions. So you should keep in mind that to not accept Vic Wellington characterizations about literacy when they go that everyone will necessarily act rationally. So you should always keep in mind that people are not perfect actors that know everything. Another key idea, I suppose, is that markets, so that they're often an efficient way of allocating resources. So why are markets possibly a good thing? They basically have no government bias, or at least you hope not. If you assume that a market works well, then you haven't got a communist situation where the party is taking all of the money, or the party is making all of those decisions. So in that way, it is more fair, I suppose. Also, that it provides a way of discovering people's preferences. If I arbitrarily set a price for something, I have no idea how much you actually want it. And it's only by setting a price and seeing what happens to your behavior that I can change that. Also, it's generally claimed that they increase innovation and growth. And I think that's just pretty much accepted fact. Okay, it should be admitted though that markets are often extraordinarily dysfunctional. So there are four kind of main classes of things where markets fail. The first one is when markets don't actually incorporate all the costs into them. So if you cause an external damage to someone else, but you're only paying for the benefit or cost to yourself, then you are no longer, then that market is not functioning properly. So if you're a factory and you're dumping all of this toxic chemical waste into the river, and all you're paying for is the metal that you use to make the car, then clearly there is a market failure here, and the government might step in to either regulate that out of existence or to make you pay for that. It might even sell parts of the river off and give you polluting rights if it really wanted to. A second reason is market power. So if a company starts to control the market, then it no longer functions as well. So this obviously happens in cases where there's only one corporation, but it can happen all the time. Market power problems are actually pretty common. Thirdly, informational problems. Do I know what a company is doing? Most of you are probably unaware, but pretty much everyone in the world has been ripped off by airlines for years because they got together about 5 to 10 years ago and made up a pricing cartel where they would all just basically agree to raise prices and were stupid enough to put up all of the minutes of this on the web, and are currently being massively prosecuted around the world to the tune of, in Australia, about $100 million, but worldwide several billion in class actions. So, other note, don't put up minutes if you're going to try and defraud everyone. But generally, information problems are a problem. So if I don't know anything about the quality for a product, I might be being sold a lemon, for all I know. So And fourthly, the idea of social welfare. So markets can sometimes cause huge poverty and inequality problems that markets themselves are incapable of solving. This is why we have things like redistributive taxes. And it's a possible argument for affirmative action, although not a particularly good one. Role of the government. Okay, here's probably the part of economics where there's the least agreement. There are obviously lots of different parts of the political spectrum who have very different ideas on this. There's obviously at one end the Austrian school, or as Oscar asked me to call it, the Chicago school. There is a semantic distinction between them, but they basically run the same thing, which is that they like as little government as possible. The difference being the Chicago school are moderately sane, whereas the Austrian school are not. Then there are the Keynesians, or neo-Keynesians as they are now, basically that the government can intervene in at least the short run to increase growth. This is mostly a disagreement about macroeconomics. As far as microeconomics goes, there are lots of different schools. There's new institutionalism, which is up there because I'm a new institutionalist, and that's basically that it's important for governments to provide institutional frameworks for people to live in. I'll explain what that means later, but it basically just means that one of the really important things in economics is that you provide the ability of people to have property rights and not just have all their stuff stolen. And then there's Anne Rand, and she's too crazy for me to actually discuss. Don't run in a debate, just don't. Okay, institutions, what are they? They're basically the rules of the game as they were. I've defined them there as humanly devised social, political, economic constraints. They include political systems, so democracy is a form of institution. They include the judiciary, so it's generally agreed that a strong rule of law is needed for economic growth. How might they be characterised? Well, good ones would have enforcement of property rights, so that people don't steal your stuff, constraints on elites, so that one group doesn't just take over the country, and some provision of equal opportunity. Whether that provision of equal opportunity is in terms of opportunity, it's important, sorry, to say that it's opportunity, not outcome. So the purpose of an economic system isn't, or the government isn't to make everyone in society equal, it's to have everyone to have the equal ability to climb up the social ladder. Although those two things can sometimes be interconnected. So you being poor may mean that your children are poor, and the government may have some role to fix that. Even though I would not argue in a debate, and I would not argue in real life either, that it is the role of the government to make everyone at the same level of wealth. And you probably won't be able to argue that in the debate, because I've only ever seen one motion about Marxism, and that was said in a fairly crazy British tournament. So an example of this might be environmental governance. A lot of environmental problems are better solved on a local level because local people actually know what's going on and they have some incentive to actually solve it properly. But a lot of the problem is that a lot of issues require global cooperation, which brings us to the tragedy of the commons. Basically, this is an economic principle, which is that if no one owns some piece of common property like a forest or a river or something, everyone has an incentive to personally pollute it or destroy it, even though we all have an incentive to keep it preserved. And the reason this is because unless I can sign a contract with, say, all of you, which I probably don't have enough time to negotiate, we're going to destroy the resource. But it's still my incentive to take as much as I can, knowing that you all will too. So this is a possible rationale for government intervention if there is a market failure. Okay, I'm now going to talk about something completely different. That is the idea of economic development. So there are lots of different ways to develop somewhere. The first thing to note is that obviously markets are pretty helpful in terms of development. You can't really have economic growth without some kind of market. The problem is in these countries, of course, is you have lots of corruption, so markets don't work. Therefore, we get to the idea of participative development. There have been debates before, and there was one at last year's Australs about whether microfinance in particular is a better source of funds for economic development, and it's basically an argument about whether you're better off having development top-down, so that means that where you give governments money, or whether you're better giving money to the people. Obviously, in a third world country, they're fairly likely to be corrupt, so top-down aid may not actually be the best idea. Conversely, microfinance might not be the best idea because if you're giving a loan to a really poor person, the likelihood of it being paid back is really low. Which is why for microfinance, in case you ever get a debate about it, they make the collective, basically the village, pay it off collectively so that you can't get more loans unless everyone else pays it off. So there's a social incentive to pay it off. It's generally agreed that if you're going to give aid to someone, you should set the parameters before, not after, so you can't demand things from people once you've given money to them because they can go back on it. Basically, the best way to provide aid is to make poor countries compete to be better. Random fact, military intervention increases the likelihood of future autocracy by 24%. Mostly this is because in doing development, there's a lot of what's called tied aid, even with in both military intervention and actually cash gifts, which means that the US in particular often imposes friendly autocracies rather than democracies. So aid may not be the best tool for development if it is tied. Reducing inequality is really important, so it's important to not just give these countries lots of cash if either someone is stealing all the money or someone or one group is getting all of it. And this is also important if you ever want to debate about redistributive taxes. People are more happy in more equal societies. So for the same amount of economic development, a Nordic country is more happy than the United States. Okay, now because people don't know much about it, as I learnt while debating with Rashada, I'm going to have a brief spiel about what the European debt crisis is. So I have 3 really quick questions there, and then I'm going to discuss Greece and other sundry things. Okay, so debt and bonds are basically the government selling off money with a promise to repay you at some point in the future. Generally, they will cost some kind of amount, and then the government will pay you both an interest rate and a certain amount every year, per se. So obviously this depends on the government or whoever is giving you that bond's ability to repay you in the future. Generally, markets assume that people are able to repay you in the future, but as the European experience has taught us, this isn't necessarily true, because the government can also run out of money. So one of these proposed solutions to this is what I call austerity budgets. And that basically just means that you drastically cut a lot of money out of the budget really, really quickly. Preferably out of, well, you can do it in one of 2 ways. One, you can just cut spending massively, or you can raise taxes. Generally, countries try and do both. There is mixed evidence as to whether they are a good idea or not. In the short run, they tend to decrease growth and lead to pretty awful outcomes for the people in the country. In the long run, they may make people better off. Okay, I haven't put this up on the slide, but I'm going to discuss it now in terms of how the European common currency works. Basically, what happens is that the euro operates over most of the countries in the European Union, with notable exceptions. The most important exception being the United Kingdom. Basically what it is, it's one currency over that area, as the term single currency union suggests, with apparently stringent conditions on getting in, although no one in there except Liechtenstein, I think, is currently actually following those conditions. And even on entry, most of the countries were not. So the conditions included things like budgets being only a certain percentage of GDP and not having too much debt. No one in practice follows any of these. Even the Germans do not follow the conditions, even slightly. So that's pretty bad. But it also means that there is no ability for a country to use monetary policy, so that is when, like our RBA sets interest rates, or to change the amount that its currency is worth in order to pay back its debt. So one thing that a country which is not in a single currency union can do is devalue its currency a lot, so paying its debt back is cheaper. This obviously can't happen in the European Union because there is only one currency. So Greece cannot print more money, like the Americans have virtually done with quantitative easing, which is, if you ever hear it in debate, is basically, without explaining it properly, another term for printing a lot of money and pretending that you're doing something else. Okay, so is it a good idea to keep Greece in the Eurozone, which is likely to be a topic at Australs, I imagine, because it wasn't at Worlds and the Eurozone is still pretty topical. So, okay, if we eject Greece from the Eurozone, the good arguments for it are that it will save other countries. So basically, if you hack off the really sick country, then you might be left with some countries that you can save. So you might be able to save the big ones like Portugal or Spain or Iceland if you don't have to bail out Greece. Secondly, it sends the signal that the Eurozone is actually going to be tough on countries. If the Eurozone continues to bail out Greece, then it sends the message that the Eurozone is just going to bail out everyone. And that could be really, really expensive, particularly given that Spain has about $1 trillion worth of debt and Italy is the world's 3rd largest bond market. Thirdly, you might say it's economically inefficient. One of the reasons the Greeks are in this debt crisis is because they don't pay any taxes, and you might say that it's basically their fault, and now that they've made their bed, they can lie on it. Arguments against. Firstly, you might say, well, I happen to support the against side. I'm sorry. Firstly, I think it sends a terrible signal to markets. It sends the signal that the Eurozone is incapable of saving a really tiny, pathetic little country. And if it can't do that, I don't personally get the signal, at least, that it can save Spain. Secondly, Greece will obviously, effectively burn, either literally with riots or just economically burn. And this has flow-on effects. French and German banks own a lot of Greek debt. And this will obviously send up bond yields, which is the amount of interest rate that you have to pay back on the bond, in the other weak Eurozone countries, which I think will effectively make the cost of bailing out everyone far too expensive. And thirdly, I think there's an important argument that it is actually unfair on the Greek people. Most of the reason that Greece is in its debt crisis is not because of paying too much social welfare, but actually because it had a highly dysfunctional government who are effectively cooking the books for the last 30 years. I personally think that Greece should never have been allowed into the Eurozone, but I think once you've allowed someone in, you're better off trying to pay Greece off as opposed to having to try and save bigger countries. Okay, the other kind of topical issue that I wanted to explain is the little global financial crisis we have. It was caused by two competing tendencies, and often you have to sell one of these as the bigger tendency in the debate because you're arguing against the other one. So firstly, it was by governments giving too much money to inefficient industries, so housing primarily, and also by governments conversely under-regulating other people, so the financial industry, banks, that sort of thing. So, for example, the government had no real idea what was going on with a whole bunch of really complicated securities. So, as I said, there was huge informational problems. No one, even the big banks, really had any idea what they were selling to whom. And if you look at the ownership charts of things, there are some points for which we still really don't know who owed what. To explain what happened, banks would lend money to really fairly dodgy Joes in Texas, and they would take that dodgy debt, package it together in what they call mortgage-backed securities, which were effectively worthless, then package those mortgage-backed securities into bigger securities, and also sell derivatives, which were basically things that depend on the price of the mortgage-backed security. They would then sell that debt, pretend it was worth a lot, and make huge profits. The problem with all of this, of course, is that what they were selling was effectively worthless, but the credit aid ratings who they had to pay really large fees to were saying that it was worth a lot of money, which meant that in the end, basically, everyone had done an Emperor's New Clothes Act. No one had said that the Emperor was really naked, but they probably should have. So how do we solve global financial stuff? Okay, do we have stimulus? There's evidence to suggest that stimulus can be effective if it's announced quickly, if it's implemented quickly, and it's in different forms. The one that the Rudd government implemented in Australia was a fairly poor example of how to implement stimulus because it involved just directly giving money to people which they proceeded to spend in other countries and on gambling, or paying back government things like energy bills, which is helpful to no one. If you actually wanted to implement that properly, you probably should have just had people either given cards as they are in the Northern Territory, which are then allowed to buy certain things, which would say were made in Australia, or you'd got people to bail in receipts, or you'd spend it on actually good building projects as opposed to building the education revolution, which basically is going to be giving a lot of money to government contractors. So stimulus can be good if you implement it properly, but if you don't, it's generally fairly ineffective. Secondly, you can do the precise opposite. If you think that government debt is the main reason that the global financial crisis exists, you can implement austerity. However, as I said there, slashing spending indiscriminately is both unfair to your people and generally fairly suicidal in terms of economic growth. If people see that the government is cutting all its programs, then they tend not to want to invest in the country either. So how you do austerity is important. For example, the United States needs to increase its taxes enormously to pay back its debt, and it really has although it has no way of doing this because the Republicans are nuts. Thirdly, we have regulation. It depends on, regulations can be good or can be bad. The United States' new financial regulations will basically make a lot of money for lawyers, a heap of money for lawyers actually, because they're about 7,000 pages, but they contain nothing of actual substance or use. If you wanted to implement good regulations, they would either implement something that has been a debating topic before called Glass-Steagall, where you would basically separate investment banks from retail banks, which means that you can't use the money that you get from home loans in order to do kind of risky financial trading, or you would just break up big banks. Really, banks which are too big to fail should not be allowed to exist, and there is no reason for them to exist. Trying to regulate their conduct will mean that you end up regulating them perhaps 3 years later, maybe, and that really serves no purpose other than making congressmen in Washington feel nice about themselves and putting their name on a fancy bill. So discussions of things to do with Australia. Why have a mining tax? I will also discuss why not have a mining tax, I just couldn't fit that in to the slide. Okay, the first reason to have a mining tax is that miners literally make the country worth less money because you're taking resources out of the country and shipping them overseas. They also take up resources away from other parts of the economy, which leads to decreases in manufacturing, what's known as, if you want to sound wanky, Dutch disease. Thirdly, it's often said that you need to save money for the future. Mining is not exactly a sustainable industry, given that when you run out of something, you literally have no way to make more money out of it. Also, it's highly unlikely that mining prices will hold up permanently. So whether you think the government has a role to do something about that is a different question. Okay, why not have one? Firstly, mining is obviously a pretty productive industry in Australia. It contributes a large portion of our economic growth, although it should be noted, quite a small portion of employment, which is important to note for debates. Also, it's generally thought as inefficient to tax it because it's double taxation. You are taxing companies for being companies, and then also taxing them for being mining companies who make lots of money. And that is considered unfair by some people. Whether you choose to buy that, buy that personally, I don't really care. Also, you can dispute the imperative to save money for the future. Obviously, you can say that the market will sort itself out, as it has indeed in the past. I don't want to talk at length about the carbon tax. I'm going to note a couple of things. Firstly, it's not enough to prove in a debate that climate change is bad, therefore we should implement a carbon tax. There are other alternatives to it. Obviously, there's an emissions trading scheme, which is basically that you set up a certain amount of carbon that you can pollute, divide that between people and sell it. That might be more efficient because of the stuff that I talked about earlier with the fact that you can actually get pricing data, whereas a tax is completely arbitrary. Conversely, a tax is easy to enforce and it might actually be more fair. Is it a good idea to actually sell someone a license to pollute and allow a really inefficient industry to continue to pollute a lot is a different question. I don't really want to discuss that because that would take up my whole presentation if I were to talk about it, because it's a very complicated topic, but those are some brief ideas. Okay, finally to talk about a couple of things, contracts, intellectual property and moral hazard. So why do we need contracts? Basically, without some form of contract law, and this would either be formal or some social sanction, everyone has an incentive to break the contract. So if I tell you that you just must do something, you have an incentive to break it off, and I have no incentive to pay you, which means that there is going to be nothing going on in your economy if there's no way of enforcing that contract. There are problems arising from contracts, which are that one problem is called adverse selection. I don't know whether you've given me a low quality good or not, and there is some evidence to suggest that without some form of consumer protection, good products will be driven out of the market because there's an incentive to just give everyone bad products if they can't tell whether a product is bad or not. What's called the market for lemons. Then, obviously, conversely, there's the problem of moral hazard. If the government or another industry is effectively bearing a risk for you, you might take more risky actions. So in a debate about breaking up banks which are too big to fail, you could say that one of the reasons that having a bank, bailing out banks which is too big to fail is a bad idea, is that you give similar banks the incentive to do dodgy shit in the future because they know that you will just pay them all of the money. Conversely, you could say that wouldn't exist if you regulated them properly, but that is obviously the debate. Intellectual property is also another topic which lawyers are probably vastly more qualified to talk about than I am. But the basic idea is that you need some way to guarantee that your idea isn't stolen and that you can turn your idea into money. Also, there is a positive benefit to society from having your ideas because the more knowledge we have out there and the more products we have, the better everyone else is off, at least in theory. Obviously, also, conversely, this has to have some kind of limit. So I shouldn't have the ability to make as much money as I want out of it for all time in the future. Also, it's generally considered from not as an economic point of view, but from a philosophical point of view, that you have some right to make money off what you invent, although that is obviously quite controversial. And finally, just some things to forget, i.e. don't panic. Firstly, it's worth remembering that just because economists claim that everyone acts individually, they don't. People actually, in reality, act in groups. So one of the reasons that you want affirmative action is because, in reality, people do exist in racial or gender groups and are discriminated against on that basis. Conversely, you can always run that those groups aren't existent or that they're not really helped. Secondly, you can argue that the trickle-down effect exists in the debate, and that's basically the idea that if you decrease the taxes on poor people, then the rich people, then poor people will make more money. In reality, the trickle-down effect doesn't exist. And that's not me claiming this as a lefty, this is me claiming that this is an empirical economist. There is no evidence to suggest it exists. Run in a debate all you like, but you're wrong. Thirdly, redistributive taxes may be a social good. Alternatively, you may argue that they are not, but it is worth remembering that inequality is something to consider in the debate. Fourthly, it's always worth remembering the really basic economic idea of an opportunity cost. Why do we want your policy and not the next best one? Which is important for ideas of mutual exclusivity in debate. Fifthly, and I know Oscar disagrees with me about this as well, but social contract theory is actually fairly useful in debating. If you completely abandon the idea of social contracts, lots of debates become really, really messy because they have no philosophical basis to be grounded in. I strongly disagree with Xing Li's post that it is useless. I think it's actually very useful, particularly for new debaters who can't argue things without reference to it. So that's all I wanted to say. Hopefully that has helped you a bit, and there is obviously my longer guide for people who are particularly interested in things or want to come to Australs, because it will probably help you, given that there will inevitably be at least one economics round, and given that Steve Whittington is setting topics, potentially 8.